It is time for All Church Sunday School. And I'm glad you're here with me because Shannon is not here. We are beginning a new 6-week study. And when we got ready to think about what we were going to talk about next, Shannon said, let's study the book of James. It's one of his favorites. And I said, great idea. And then he went on vacation. Really rude. I know some of you are fans of his, and you probably wonder why he would do that to me. But the good news is I made a deal with him. All right, if you're not going to be here for the first week of the book of James, then you need to send us a report from North Carolina where you are visiting your family. So we're going to dive into an introduction to the book in just a minute. But first, let's hear from Shannon.
Hey, it's Shannon. I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to let you know how excited I am that we are going to be looking at the book of James in All Church Sunday School coming up. James is one of my favorite books for several reasons. We're pretty sure it was written by one of Jesus' brothers, James, who was not a follower of Jesus while Jesus was having his earthly ministry, but apparently became a leader of the church in Jerusalem after the resurrection. And we read about that in the book of Acts. This book, there are some echoes of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in this book, but it's very short. It's only 5 short chapters, and that's one of the things I like about it. It's easy to get through in pretty quickly. But more importantly, the lessons that we learn in James are practical. They're easy to understand. They're easy to remember. And they're so applicable to living everyday life. I do love the teachings of Jesus, and I love the parables, but sometimes you have to sit with those and think about that and ruminate on what they mean. And that's a great exercise. James gives us easy to understand, practical advice for how to live the Christian life. And he warns us against several things. I'm sitting here on my mom's back porch, and I have her study Bible here in front of me, and it reminds us that James addresses pride, discrimination, greed, lust, hypocrisy, meanness, and conformity to things that are not Christ-like. Man, we certainly need every bit of that in our world today. I think probably one of my favorite verses, my favorite pieces of advice from the book of James comes right in that first chapter. I'm looking here, it's verse 19. And James reminds us to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. I think in every generation, every season, that is valuable advice for us. This was written long before anything like newspapers or television, social media were even conceived. And as we have grown closer, or as we have evolved, maybe, I'm not sure that's the correct word, but as we've evolved and have all these different means of communication now, where we can express our opinions and share ideas, it's so easy to get angry. It's easy to surround ourselves with people who believe and think just like we do. And if someone disagrees with us, then how quickly we get angry. We don't take time to listen to what somebody else has to say. So if I were to pick one verse from this entire book of James, it would be chapter 1, verse 19. So hopefully, as we go through this book, some other nuggets will reveal themselves to us. I look forward to spending some time with Renee and with all of you on this book, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.
So this is the first time, Austin, isn't it, that we've had a live report from some other state in All Church Sunday School?
Yes.
Impressive, right?
It is. It's very impressive.
Almost like he's our on assignment. Shannon on assignment in North Carolina, where the book of James probably looks a whole lot like it looks in Fort Worth this morning as we're doing this. So, How about an introduction? And then over the course of the next 5 weeks, we'll be studying one chapter a week. And I'll remind you about that when we get to the end. But first, an introduction. And I want to tell you that I hope by now you are a person like me with a collection of different translations of Scripture and different study Bibles. And I want to demonstrate for you the variety that you get when you study with several different sources. So we're going to talk about something of a controversy, I suppose, in some circles, and that is who exactly wrote the book of James. So, Austin, I want you to listen to these two arguments and tell me which one you think is the most persuasive.
Sounds good.
All right, the first one's coming from the HarperCollins Bible Dictionary, and they're suggesting that the author of the book is not the brother of Jesus. Here's how they make their case. First of all, the author identifies himself only as James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. Because only one James was apparently of such stature as to speak with authority in the latter part of the first century, one may assume with the ancient church that the book is the work of the brother of Jesus. But here's why that may not be true. Number one, the excellent Greek in the letter makes it unlikely that the author was from Galilee. Number two, there is a section in chapter 2 pushing back against the teaching that's in Paul's letters, and those letters wouldn't have been collected and available to James before his death in AD 66. Number three, the early church debate over authorship would be unlikely if the author was the brother of Jesus. That would be a VIP. Nobody would be arguing about it, even all these centuries later. All right, so that is the case for the author not being the brother of Jesus. Now I want to give you the other side, and this time we're going to turn to the New International Version Study Bible. They believe the author, the editors of that Bible, believe the author was the brother of Jesus, and here's how they make their case. The author identifies himself as James, and he was probably the brother of Jesus and leader of the Jerusalem Council, which you can read about in Acts chapter 15. 4 men in the New Testament have this name. The author of this letter could not have been the Apostle James, who died too early, 44 AD. The other 2 men mentioned with the name of James had neither the stature nor the influence that the writer of this letter had. Next, it has been plausibly suggested that the initial recipients of the letter were believers from the early Jerusalem church. After Stephen's death, they were scattered as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, Syria, and Antioch. This would account for James' references to trial and oppression. James wrote as a pastor with authority and an intimate knowledge of his readers. As leader of the Jerusalem church, James wrote to instruct and encourage his dispersed flock in the face of difficulties. All right, Austin, I asked for your opinion here. Which side are you going to go with? That the writer was the brother of Jesus or was not? Based on those two arguments.
I am someone who is very, what's the word I'm thinking of? I'm very critical about a lot of things, thanks to the education I've had. And part of my belief with this, I don't know, I feel like it's, especially with the HarperCollins Bible Dictionary, with the second point being like, hey, Paul's letters wouldn't be available to the James who died in AD 66. I feel like it isn't that brother. It isn't
okay.
brother
It
of
is
Jesus.
not the brother of Jesus who wrote it.
Yes.
All right. And I think both sources state some important facts about this, but I definitely think maybe there's a little bit more historical facts in the argument that it was not the brother of Jesus. which I know will make Shannon really disappointed because he liked to think it was the brother of Jesus who wrote this. But that's just a great example, I think, that we want to have more than one source. We always want to be open to the ways that scholars, contemporary scholars, and scholars over a period of time have approached each of the books in the Bible, the history. Let's talk a little bit more about the other details, and in particular, who was the letter written to? Well, this also depends on who you think the author was. But if you believe that it was not the brother of Jesus, then we think the letter was intended to be received by Jewish Christians living in or near Palestine. This conclusion is based on a lot in the book of James that aligns with the Gospel of Matthew. We'll make note of that in the weeks ahead. The sections in chapter 2 and 5 that talk against rich people suggest, according to scholars, that the intended readers of this book were socially marginalized. I think that's an interesting point. As we get to those sections, let's remember that may say something to us about to whom the letter was addressed. All right, what about the form of the book of James? Well, the introduction reads like an epistle, a biblical word for letter, but the rest of the book doesn't seem like a letter at all. We call it the letter of James, but it only appears like in letter form right at the beginning, right off the top. Instead, the content, James is composed of many self-contained units on a variety of subjects without obvious development or thought or sustained argument, almost like you would find perhaps in a devotional book where you move from one day to the next and there's a thought for the day and it's around a scripture, but there's not really a connection between each of the entries in the devotional book. The same can be said for the content of James. Now, a little bit more about the form. Chapter 1 seems to be kind of a table of contents for the book, announcing in advance, all right, here are the topics that we're going to take up as we move through. And then the separate units are held together by one overarching emphasis on deeds or works. And that puts Paul and James, their teaching, kind of competing with each other in the book of James, almost like a debate. And here's an example of that from Paul, Romans 3:28. So we are made right with God through faith and not by obeying the law. And then the writer of James would say in chapter 2, verse 24, so you see, we are shown to be right with God by what we do, not by faith alone. What do you think, Austin? Are those pretty diametrically opposed positions, those two?
Yes, they're very clashing.
Yes.
And just in the idea of like what faith and law means to each writer and how that corresponds and how that kind of like really just goes hand in hand with someone or not hand in hand with another one.
Right.
So it's definitely like a call and response just later in the Bible.
Exactly. If you were going to a debate and people stood up and stated their case, we see Paul and James on different sides. Here's an interesting comment from one of the sources that I studied. The language from Paul and James is so similar, like they're taking each other on, like it's a smackdown. The language is so similar that we might think there's some relationship between the two writers, that they might have known each other. And we do know that the Apostle Paul met with the brother of Jesus. We do know that happened. But it's almost like they're in the same conversation. We're interrupting them as they argue with each other. So the language from Paul and James is very similar. But the second point made by this source was the most likely explanation is that James is to be understood as a critique of the misuse of Paul's teaching on justification by faith. That once Paul's original teaching was passed from one believer to another, from one congregation to another, people took some liberties with the points that Paul was making, made Paul seem much more overt in what he was saying. And what James was taking on, the writer of James, was how Paul's words had been distorted and how they had been exaggerated in some ways, that Paul's teaching seemed the opposite of how James thought faith worked in people's lives. So Paul was bigger than life. We've talked about that together on All Church Sunday School. And of course, he was quoted, and his lessons were taught by lots of other people in the early church. And everybody, I guess it's possible that they took some liberties with what he was teaching. Can you think of an example, Austin, of how that happens, even in the news? Somebody quoting somebody else, and
I mean, Paul, okay, like, I know if you've attended our live show, when we were doing Paul and Jesus, the book by, I forgot his name, that one scholar, and how we got... James Tabor, yes, our favorite. And how we got responses from our audience saying, Paul is kind of like a fanatic in some sense of the word. And especially with what we're talking about with the book of James, it feels like there's a game of telephone being played, especially with Paul's teachings. And Paul was a very, to put it lightly, he was a very devoted person.
He was a force.
He was a force of humanity, and he was very devoted to very literal teachings of Jesus. So to see, after Paul's passing and how people can take his writings and just translate it to their current situation, it becomes a game of telephone where you start with one thing, it becomes something else. And from what it seems like, the book of James, or the writer of James, is definitely saying, hey, let's pull back a second. Let's stop for a second, see what's going on, and reevaluate where we are.
And let's look at the other side,
yes.
Faith as reflected in how we live our lives, in addition to what we know to be true. So maybe the writer of James was arguing for a little moderation after people had taken the teaching of Paul a little too far. So that's very thoughtful to think that James was not pushing back directly on how Paul had taught. So let's talk about themes in the book of James. One of the most prominent themes is patience. Another one in parallel is wisdom. James is, according to N.T. Wright, who wrote a lot about the book of James, including a Bible study, he suggested that James is the most obvious example in the New Testament of writing in Hebrew scriptures that we describe as wisdom literature, which I think is really interesting to think as we move through these coming weeks, those Old Testament sources around wisdom. Maybe this is the New Testament book of wisdom, the book of James. And the book was written to encourage Christians across the world. The writer of James says the letter is written to the 12 dispersed tribes of Israel. And wherever they are in the world, James is a call to face up to the challenge of living our faith. Now, I found one more thing I wanted to share with you all in terms of an introduction to the book of James. And this comes from another source I'd like to recommend to you, the Spiritual Formation Bible. It is really a great resource and very different from the other study Bibles that you might find. Very devotional throughout, little sections of reflection are included next to key scriptures throughout the Bible. And this will give you a flavor. This is the introduction to the book of James, just a clip from that, from the Spiritual Formation Bible. Here's what they write. The straightforward, common sense approach of this letter is refreshing, although it might challenge and confront those who are comfortable in certain patterns of neglect and of indifference towards others. And then 3 verses quoted. Be doers and not hearers who deceive themselves. Understand this: you do well if you really fulfill the royal law. These are the directives of a writer who is intent on reiterating or fleshing out the ancient words of the prophet Micah. He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? That's Micah 6:8, one of the greatest hits. As you contemplate these chapters, let them be like candles lighting your soul, life, and habits. How do they describe you or your church? How do they challenge you toward greater faithfulness in loving others? In the down to brass tacks spirit of this letter, consider this question throughout your reading. What are specific and concrete ways in which I can respond to what I am reading? Ask God to lead you into authentic behaviors and attitudes that, in challenging ways and ways that may very well stretch you, allow you to put your faith to work. I love the way that's written, and it gives you an idea of the wonderful resources throughout this particular study Bible that allow you to reflect and take in what you were reading and ask questions that can make the words come alive in your life. And I think James, in our conversations to come, will be challenging all of us to walk the walk where our faith is concerned. I'm looking forward to being challenged by that. And I'm thankful for you, Austin, for helping me have somebody to talk to so I won't
Yes,
be
of
all
course.
alone in the studio today. And next week, Shannon will be back. So in preparation, chapter 1 of the book of James. And we look forward to the conversation next week. See you then.